we're arguing that it's not to completely critique what's been done in the faith at work space. There's a lot of good stuff that's been done, and we've been building on that. But we think that these times are special, and we think that a new approach is really needed, one that emphasizes slightly different aspects of our faith that often we feel as Christians kind of marginalized. And there are some places where that definitely happens. But more often than not, we find ourselves in power, we have resources, and we need to think on and reflect on how we can use those resources in what I would call a more Christianly way, rather than kind of jumping into spaces and thinking like, okay, how am I being marginalized here? I think, again, that sometimes happens, but we want to maybe have a bit of a different approach.
Well, hi there, guys. Welcome to another episode of the Faith Roundtable. I'm Josh Burtram, your host here, where we look at all sorts of different perspectives, talk to scholars, thought leaders, different leaders in business, theologians, all sorts of people about what's going on in the Christian world, particularly in America, but even beyond. And of course, I'm your faithful host on the Faithful Politics podcast. It happens here on the same channel. So make sure you guys are liking, subscribing, doing that stuff that gets this out to other people so that they can enjoy it and they can actually be influenced by what we're going on. We try to bring out really good content for you guys. And today is no different. We're going to be interviewing Elaine Howard Ecklund. She is the Herbert A.S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences, a professor of sociology, and director of the Banuik, I should have asked before.
That's okay, Boniuk.
Institute at Rice University. Thank you. She's best known for her sociological work on the intersection of science and religion, and has also published research on religious discrimination, religion and immigration, religion and race, and religion in the workplace. She's the author of numerous books and research articles, including Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, which is super interesting. And maybe we'll have to have you on again to talk about that, because today we're talking about your book, latest book, Working for Better, a new approach to faith at work. And we're super excited to dig into that with you. Elaine, thank you so much. Dr. Ecklund, Elaine, which one do you prefer?
You can call me Elaine, and I'll call you Josh if that's okay.
Yeah. Absolutely, please do. And thank you for coming on the program and spending some time with us.
Gosh, thank you so much for having me. It's just always a privilege when people actually read your work and want to talk to you about it. So thanks so much for that.
Absolutely. I'm really serious. I'm super interested in the faith and science thing. So maybe you'll have to come back on to the Faithful Politics podcast and we could talk about how crazy the faith and science and all this stuff, or maybe just come back on to another one of these. I would love to talk about that, but I don't want to get away from what we're here to talk about today, which is your latest book, Working for Better. And I gotta ask, what is, just digging right into it, what inspired you to write this book? Why did you feel like you needed to put your time, energy, and intellectual prowess to work talking about work? I would love to hear.
Yeah. So two kinds of things. There's an academic reason. I've been working the past 20 years on studying what scientists think about religion and how they relate to religious communities. And I was just like, I need to go broader than that. I need to understand what other types of workers and other types of workplaces think about the relationship of their faith to their work. And then I was in a conference with Denise Daniels, my co-author, and we became friends. This is sort of the more personal reason. And we're like, this is such a geeky thing, Josh. But, what do two academics do who want to keep in touch? We're like, let's work on a research project together. And let's write a book together. And Denise is an expert on how Christians approach faith at work. She's a professor at Wheaton College, comes from a very different context than I do. And we're like, let's really just sort of, merge those two contexts and do a big study that'll keep us going for a long time together, trying to understand what people think about faith at work. And so we wrote one book called Religion in a Changing Workplace, and that's really for other academics who are interested in the workplace and for business leaders who want to sort of be more intelligent about how they incorporate religion or don't incorporate religion in their workplaces. And then we're like, we're both Christians, and there was just so many interesting findings in our study that were specifically related to Christians. So we're like, we really think we have some kind of moral responsibility to write a book that's really specifically for the Christian community too. And as I said, that personal reason, we wanted to keep working together longer. And so we're like, let's write a second book.
I love it. That's really great. I would love to kind of state your thesis and then kind of hear you, like what you think about this formulation of it. Does that work? Can I do that for you?
Yeah, sure.
So here's a thesis of the book, the main idea, big idea. Christians should replace an individualized rights defending approach to workplace faith with a radical embrace model, one that recognizes every worker's Imago Dei, actively resolves 5 documented faith at work tensions, which you talk about in the book, and seeks justice, fairness, and flourishing and for all in the workplace. Does that resonate? How do you feel about that?
Perhaps unsurprising. Josh, you're really good. And I hope you'll write that description on Amazon when you do your review of the book. But that's exactly right. So the book title is Working for Better. So if you take all of the stuff that you just aptly said, and, if we do all of that, then I think Christians can really use our workplaces to make the world better and use our faith to make our workplaces better. And we're arguing that it's not to completely critique what's been done in the faith at work space. There's a lot of good stuff that's been done, and we've been building on that. But we think that these times are special. And we think that a new approach is really needed, one that emphasizes slightly different aspects of our faith that often we feel as Christians kind of marginalized. And there are some places where that definitely happens. But more often than not, we find ourselves in power, we have resources, and we need to think on and reflect on how we can use those resources in what I would call a more Christianly way, rather than kind of jumping into spaces and thinking like, okay, how am I being marginalized here? I think, again, that sometimes happens, but we want to maybe have a bit of a different approach.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'd love to dive in. Like there's a few aspects, I'm just going to stick to the argument as much as I can here from the book, but I'd love to kind of dive into these concepts here and have you elaborate on them so we can understand it and get kind of a full sense of what you guys are trying to do. So this idea that all people are made in the image of God, I mean, I definitely believe that. I'm a pastor, theologian, and all of that, but I would love to hear from you. What does that mean that they're made in the image of God? Like, not necessarily a theological answer, which that's fine to bring that theology in it, because I think that sets a foundation. But really, what does that mean for us practically, right, as we're interacting with people in the workplace?
Yeah, that's where we really try to go in this book. So the book has these short chapters and discussion questions at the end of each chapter. So we're hoping people use it like in small groups or in a kind of practical way. And practically, that Imago Dei, that image of God concept, means that, whether or not the person has our particular faith as Christians, whether or not the person is in power in our organization, whether or not we like the person, frankly, sometimes we work with people that we don't actually like very much, that every single person that's walking around is an image bearer of God. And so then as Christians, we maybe then have a responsibility to look at another person who we might not like and say, gosh, what's the God image in this person that I need to learn from? I think there's a sense where, really believing that deeply. And some of us need help, I think, believing that deeply because our times right now are just incredibly fractured and polarized, and there's lots not to like. We need to work sometimes on really believing that Imago Dei concept more deeply. But when we do, I think it's so deeply practical. Like it's like we call in society, we call it standpoint theory. It's like what's your stance? You can think of this in a very physical way. Like, how are you holding yourself
Hmm.
when you come to another person? Like, are you putting your fists up ready to fight? Or do
Hmm.
you have a kind of openness towards embrace? Not that we're going to physically hug people, but
Right.
that we have an openness to the other and we're thinking all the time, like, what is the God stuff going on with this person? That just really changed me, when I started thinking about it that way. The academy is really a controversial space right now.
Yes.
My day to day job is as a professor, and there's lots of stuff going on there. But I find that if I kind of relax into my relationship with God, and then I'm able to see other people made in that image, then my whole stance changes.
And what is it about why do you think that your stance changes? Like, even digging a little bit deeper in that, why is this concept so powerful for you in terms of being able to empathize and understand other people? I would just love to kind of hear you think out loud on that, because I think that what you're talking about is where the rubber meets the road. Like, we hear about Imago Dei. I might preach about that at my church. I started a church 5 years ago, around the time that we started the podcast.
Ah, good for you. Yeah.
Yes, but in that, like, teach image of God, but this is like a really practical working out of it. And I'd love for you to hear, like, what is it about that makes you feel like you can treat people differently than you might have before?
Especially in workplaces, we often think, Josh, that we have a lot to prove, right? Especially in uncertain economic times where some people feel like, oh gosh, if I don't do exactly the right things, if I don't relate to my boss in exactly the right way, then I might lose my job. And when we feel like on that kind of tightrope, then I think we're tempers can flare, we can get kind of all messed up inside. But for me, that Imago Dei concept really starts with me. So it's not just that other people are made in the image of God, it's that I am too. Which, if I am fully loved by God and I am fully made in God's image, then that for me cuts down on some of that defensiveness where I have to really prove myself. It's like we're all little kids inside, right? We're all looking to be loved. And if I got to prove myself and make myself perfect, then it's really hard to then lean into the other and try to figure out, how they're really made in the image of God.
Yeah, I really like that. It's so important as we're thinking about the people that we're interacting with. All of them, there's like this equality and this inherent dignity that comes with understanding that they're made by the same God I am. Even if they don't believe in that God, they're still made. My theology, right, tells me that even when they don't believe, they're still made and given this, like, image of God, that this deep essence of who they are that gives them identity, worth, and value. And so then I can start from there, and my foundation is such that I can be there for them. I can treat them in a way that I would want to be treated. I can understand them. There's so many things that can grow out of that foundation. I think it's a really practical and a really just inspiring concept to bring into the workplace. And I just absolutely love that. Yeah, I would love to kind of dig into more of this idea of a traditional Christian faith at work model, like that emphasizes like individual expression and defending Christian rights. First, like, what is the faith at work? Like, what are these kind of traditional faith at work models? And kind of how have they gone wrong? Because I think individual expression, defending Christian rights. I'm an individual. I'm a Christian. I want to be able to express myself, and I also want my rights defended. And yet I can see where this might go
Mhm.
awry. What did you find about that? What is kind of the inadequacy maybe of those models?
I think it starts with seeing our faith as really separate from our work. In our study, we found a surprising number of people who, in the US, in lots of different kinds of workplaces, who see, say, pastoral work as being much more spiritual than other kind of work, missions work as being much more spiritual than other kind of work, and just don't have an imagination for how their Sunday and their Monday meets, is what some have said. how they really bring what they're learning in church into the workplace. They just don't have an imagination for that. And there's lots of good stuff out there that shows us how to do that. So that's, I would say, the kind of stage one that a lot of us are really stuck in. There's another set of us that are stuck in what I would call stage two, which is we're bringing our faith into the workplace, but we're kind of stuck in the defensive posture that you and I have been talking about, where we're like, oh my gosh, she's discriminating against me. Again, I keep saying this because I've studied workplaces where this is definitely true, that Christians and people of other religious traditions are definitely being discriminated against. But I think if we show up to work expecting that, rather than kind of holding an openness towards the other, and thinking of it as our responsibility, this is where where Denise and I kind of want to get, people to move more towards actually thinking it's our responsibility as Christians to defend the other, to really care about our Muslim brothers and sisters and to care about those who have no religion, who feel perhaps marginalized by people who are too outspoken about their own faith. And so if we kind of get in the mix and start thinking about the other, I actually think that will help workplaces as a whole become a lot healthier. So it's kind of like moving people along.
Yeah. So this idea of like defending Christian rights, how in your work in your research, like why do you think this has become such a hot button and maybe hot button is not the word I'm looking for. I'm really asking, why has it become such a motivating factor? This defending Christian rights. You can think out loud, whatever you think, no one's going to hold you to this, like if it's not like this really well-researched, answer that you've had. But I'm just curious. I would love if you have done a lot of research on that. Obviously, I would love to hear that. But I'm just curious, like, why do you think this has become such an issue?
Two kinds of things come to mind, Josh. So I want your listeners to know there are radically different dynamics depending on the region of the country you're in. So if you're in the northeastern United States or you're in the northwestern piece of the United States, that is a wholly different place than being in Texas, where I'm.
In the upper corners, right?
Yeah, in the upper corners versus the down south. And then we have the flyover states. I hate calling them that because actually I love the Midwest. But those places, the Midwest and the southern United States, tend to have a lot more Christians demographically. And the northeastern United States and the northwestern United States tend to have a lot more secular people. All of those places have a certain number of religious minorities. There's a few more religious minorities in cities where there tends to be a lot of immigration, like Houston, where I am.
Yeah.
So you have these different dynamics. I would say in Texas and in some places in the Midwest and other southern states, it is quite tempting, I think. I think we've gotten sort of used to people thinking Christianity is okay. And then it becomes tempting as Christians, I think, to kind of keep demanding more, keep demanding our rights. I think some of our respondents said this is not just like me thinking out loud. This is something that was said by our respondents. Things like the U.S. is started as a Christian nation. Christianity is the best religion. Christianity needs to be more in the school system and things like that. And
this is absolutely happening all over our country.
It's actually happening all over the country. And then, and Christianity is also, so there's region. And then in the northeastern United States and the northwestern United States, there is a really different sensibility where secularism really reigns supreme in a different kind of way. And people of all religious traditions feel like, religion is just something we can never talk about. Should I dare to ask off for a particular religious holiday? Should I dare to ask if there's a prayer space in my workplace? These are really different dynamics. And then I do think, I know this is your other podcast, but I do think that there's a sense where religion
You can talk about whatever you want on this, by the way. You don't have to keep it to this, but yeah.
Then there is a sense where religion and politics, I think, and I'll just say, what I think that sadly are becoming too fused. And there is a sense where, people's politics is driving their Christianity rather than their Christianity driving their politics. And so it's not that we shouldn't use our Christian thinking to influence how we think about politics, but when we start, letting our politics completely drive our Christian faith and our expression of Christian faith, then I think, we're in trouble. And these are all things that our respondents said when we did our study. We did this surveys of 15,000 people in different types of workplaces, and then we interviewed about 300 of them, including focus groups with pastors and other religious leaders and that kind of thing.
I mean, we have talked about on this program, well, not Faith Roundtable, but Faithful Politics, Christian nationalism, the issues with even religious nationalism, because it's not just Christian nationalism right now. There is a resurgence of religious
exactly
nationalism
right.
globally.
Globally. I was just going to, I just said that same sentence. Yeah, that's other stuff. I direct this institute at Rice University, the Banyak Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance. And that's like my other hat. Thinking
you know
about
so much. Why haven't we had you on Faithful Politics before?
Well,
That's
I'm so
my
happy
question.
to be here now. Thank you for saying that. Thank you.
We will get you on the other one, when you have time. But we've talked about it so much, and you're absolutely right. It's a major issue right now. And of course, the workplace is out of the home. I mean, right? People probably spend more time or they do spend more time in the workplace.
They do. It's the domain where the average person spends the most time at work. I always say besides sleeping, but most of us work more than we sleep. And
you're right.
And so that is the place where we're spending the most of our time. And so if we have, putting on my, pastoral hat to some extent, if we have a kingdom mindset, gosh, we want to give a lot of thought to the workplace as an expression of God's kingdom. And, how can we really, I love that title. I have to give the press, InterVarsity Press credit. They helped us come up with that. But I love that idea of working to make the world better, to make the world more whole.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, like, you think about the amount of time, again, people spend in the workplace, and it is the avenue. It's not the avenue. It's the atmosphere, the environment in which any kind of like religion, any kind of worldview, any kind of values, they're going to get lived out in the workplace. There's just no escaping that. And that's like where the rubber meets the road the most amount of times for most people, right? Is they're going to be in this workplace, or if they're a student, it's going to be in the school, right? And so, I think that's so important. And I loved, like, I found it absolutely fascinating looking at the 5 tensions essentially that you guys uncovered in this multi-year research. And that is an impressive number. 15,000, that's a significant amount of people to be able to survey. 300 interviews, I imagine that was an enormous amount of work. Taking all that, organizing all that, categorizing all those responses. But you came up with the five key tensions. I would love for you to kind of describe how you came out, how you figured those out, and what they are. And you don't have to go into depth in any of them. We can pick maybe one or two after you kind of give a general overview. But I'd love for our listeners to hear what are these 5 tensions? How'd you find them, and what are they?
So we found the 5 tensions by drawing out the Christians in our whole data set. And it wasn't hard because the U.S. is demographically, there's lots of listeners who are going to really disagree with me when I say this, but the U.S. is demographically a Christian nation, right? The most people who are religious are Christians, right? And we wanted to serve Christians and serve churches, so we pulled the Christians out of the data. For this book, we pulled Christians out of the data and we just looked at them and the kinds of things they were talking about. And then we overlaid that with our own experiences. Both Denise and I have been deeply involved in these faith at work questions for a number of years. And we wanted to just look at how the world is changing. And the first chapter is called A Look at How the World is Changing. And given all that's happening right now, decreases in birth rates is one kind of demographic change. An increase in the number of people who have no religion. An increase in immigration. Immigrants who are Christians, immigrants who are secular, and immigrants who are part of other world religions. Increase in inequality, that there's just a huge distance between the poorest people and the richest people. So all of those changes really have an impact in how we think about being Christians in the workplace. And so we look at the world as changing. The first tension is from secular work to sacred work. So just advocating that we want to, and I hope you'll appreciate this as a pastor. I'm sure you're doing this in your church, given our conversation so far, really helping people think through how to live out their faith in their particular sphere.
Yes.
Then we talk about moving from protecting ourselves and what are the conditions under which it makes a lot of sense to protect ourselves as workplaces as Christians, to having this different kind of stance that you and I have been talking about, Josh. We're really working to protect the others, moving from protecting just ourselves to protecting the other, moving from focusing on our individual responsibilities to our collective responsibilities. So focusing on system thinking. This is where we draw in a lot of sociological kind of reflection, but also a lot of theological reflection. There's a lot in the Bible about how sin is really systemic and permeates all through our institutions. So how can we move from thinking as individuals to thinking, especially those of us who have power at organizations, thinking about moving from fairly restricted roles for women. Sometimes people carry over certain kinds of ideas that they've gained in their Christian communities into workplaces. And then just thinking about how we can really see men and women flourish and serve together in workplaces. And then our last tension is moving from a fairly narrow form of evangelism to just talking about Christian faith to thinking about living a principled pluralism. And love to talk about that one more in particular, because that's something that I really care about. And then our last chapter is on rest. And it doesn't have a tension. We just wanted that sense that we are not our jobs, that our identity is about something larger. And we really come back to that Imago Dei and, turn the lens, as it were, on ourselves and say, we've written this book about work, but we want to end this book about rest, so that we are not just encouraging people to be human doings rather than human beings.
Yes.
And so that's where we end the book. So happy to jump into any of that you find interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would love to hear which one was most surprising to you that you saw from, like, I guess, which one of those tensions did you not anticipate or predict in your thinking?
I guess I found it a little bit surprising that so few people think systems in their workplaces, just because there's a lot
Mm,
of good, like, organizational psychology work, and there's a lot of good theological thinking about how we can create healthy systems, that I was really surprised that people, thought about sort of their individual ethical responsibilities and very much in terms of their workplace as a whole. So they were content sometimes to just look the other way if they thought ethical things were going on in systems as a
hmm.
whole. They're like, well, I'm acting ethically individually. And so I don't want to, kind of rock the boat too much by trying to address the system as a whole. And this sometimes happens for leaders in particular. This is the reality, right? Now that we all work at home part of the time.
Yes.
So there is this sense where people really do struggle to see how they can have an impact on systems. And I love to tell the story. I was in an airport once during a blackout. You maybe remember this time there was like about 15 years ago where there was a blackout on the northeastern seaboard, and I just happened to be flying during that
Mm,
time. So I come into this airport, and they're like, the people who manage the airport are just hanging their head in their hands. The security systems are all down. They essentially have these like thousands of people trapped in this airport, no toilets. And there was one woman there who clearly was responsible for the wheelchairs. And she got her team. I had no idea how many wheelchair attendants there are. There's like 40 or 50 of them in a huge airport. She got her team together, and she was going to help them be calm, and she was going to take them around and work in her domain and make sure everyone who had any kind of mobility issues had a wheelchair to sit in. And she went throughout the entire airport doing this. So she wasn't particularly powerful in the organization, but she thought systems. And she thought, like, I'm not just going to take my wheelchair and get the person who's standing next to me. I am responsible for this whole wheelchair collective, and I'm going to go throughout the entire system of the airport and figure out who needs a wheelchair and care for people and train my people. She was like talking to them. I mean, as a sociologist, I was like watching this unfold, and the people who are in charge of stuff are literally like putting their head in their hands and just like going totally out of script. They're like, we have no idea what to do. This has never happened before. And so this worker, who's probably lower level on the org chart, is thinking much more broadly. And I think that's what we really want to encourage people to do, is to think like, how can I address sin and systems in a bit more systemic and long-lasting way than just beyond my individual responsibilities. Hope I haven't talked too
Yeah.
much about that, but it's just something that was super
No, I
interesting
love
to me.
that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it really tracks, I think, with a broader societal trend that I've noticed where, especially if I'm thinking about race, we've talked about race a lot on the podcast, and the idea of systemic injustice and how difficult it is for those in the majority to recognize that there is systemic injustice, or those in power to recognize that there is systemic injustice. Like, we'll think something like, well, I'm not racist personally. And so because I'm not racist, I don't really have any say on any of this other stuff, then it kind of gets this place where, well, there is no systemic racism. That's either people are racists or not. That's it. There is nothing beyond that. And so what we found, of course, is that systems are made of people and their bias is kind of baked into the cake, so to speak. And what we know is that these systems do become, even if they're not explicitly biased, they can certainly be implicitly biased. And it's hard to sometimes recognize that, but it totally tracks with this sense of like, hey, I'm doing my thing. I'm not going to worry about anything beyond me. That's someone else's responsibility. That's someone else's thinking. Did you find anything that related to why people do that, like in the workplace? Well, let me put it this way. We actually interviewed some people on Faithful Politics that said they essentially were making the argument that there's a middle section of organizations. Like you have macro, which they would say, right, the government, micro, family, and an individual, but then the meso or whatever, like this
Oh my
idea
gosh, you're
that,
talking like a sociologist. Wow, thank you.
well, these
You
are
have
their
totally
words,
done your
right?
homework.
Yeah, these are their words. So, and basically this idea that, right, the organizations, that's where this stuff, like, there's a lot of, like, we can impact organizations, whereas we have very little impact on the macro. We have a lot of impact on the micro, but we have like an in-between impact on the meso, I guess, of course, depending on how big that organization is. Like an Amazon versus a mom and pop shop, those are very different, right? So what is it in your research that, like, did you get any insight on why people feel like why they don't think systemically, I guess?
There's a couple of things that come to mind. One is that for Christians who feel called to their work, they feel kind of lucky, to be doing work where they do feel like they can serve God. And sometimes when you feel lucky like that, you don't want to rock the boat. And so for themselves, we found that, like, both for themselves and others, people who feel called to their work are kind of like, I'm doing God's work here. I should just put up with stuff. So we did notice this, especially with racial discrimination, that sometimes our Black and our brown employees who were also more likely to be Christians. So those who are non-white are more likely to be Christians in U.S. society than those who are white. So these faithful Christians are like, I really shouldn't rock the boat here and talk about how I'm being discriminated against because, I'm in an occupation where generally I feel like I can serve God. And so they kind of put up with stuff, not thinking about how, them putting up with discrimination perhaps doesn't address a kind of systemic inequality. And then there is a sense where those who feel called also feel like perhaps other people are making too much of discrimination as well. And so being called to your work then makes it more likely that you'll think other people should put up with difficult kinds of situations at work as well, which I thought was super, super interesting. I think
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it's in part because we have, and we saw this in some of our interviews, Josh, where people talk a lot about Christian faith in the United States. I haven't seen this as much in studies I've done outside the US, that it's an individual faith. It's kind of me and God, against
Yes.
the world. We're heavily influenced by Protestant thinking and Reformation thinkers. The Reformation thinkers were also really systems people, right? They thought all of the world is God's world and all of it can be used to his glory. And so they actually didn't have that kind of individualistic mindset in as much as we have applied it. It's like we're reading our Christian faith through the lens of U.S. individualism. And so when you're
Yes.
in that kind of individualistic mindset, you're just kind of like, oh my gosh, well, how can I ever do anything larger than that? I just got to make sure I'm ethical. We heard that so much, like that being a Christian
Hmm.
is like just making sure I'm doing ethical work.
That's like, as long as they're not doing something wrong. Did you find any places where that wasn't the case? Like, did you find any thresholds, I guess, where like if the job was, I don't know, if it's a corporation known for polluting the world, I don't know, where there's some kind of like sense that they wouldn't work or they couldn't be a part of it. What was there a threshold in your findings or
We
what?
didn't find so much that there was a threshold in terms of ethical substance. So it wasn't like, if it's this kind of discrimination, fine, but if it's this other discrimination, then I'm going to really speak up. It wasn't so
Mm,
much in the substance. It was almost like a theological threshold
hmm.
where people who are really trained to think about the world and issues of injustice. We found that some of our Black church respondents are largely Black church respondents. We have one great example where someone actually invited their pastor to the workplace. Their pastor is also has legal training and was like, I'm going to have my boss talk with my pastor. Now that is very, very unusual. This is like not going to happen
Wow.
in most places. But in that particular church, they were really talking about issues of justice and how Christians have a responsibility to really fight for the other. A particular person we interviewed thought that perhaps other people were being discriminated against and so invited their pastor along. It was very interesting. Again, unusual, but I think it's more the kind of theological reflection that people have been exposed to in their congregations, which helps them recognize a sort of threshold for action rather than it being about a specific issue.
So it's like when they've been in an environment where enough people are saying, "Hey, think about systemic issues. Think about, it's more beyond me. What do you think about the others?" Because it's almost like thinking systemically is almost to oversimplify it. It's almost kind of expanding your thoughts beyond yourself to
Mhm.
others.
Yeah, so much of this is, right? I want to go back to something I said at the beginning of our conversation. I do think it starts with personal reflection, getting that kind of, to what extent do I feel completely loved by God? Do I feel completely secure? And then I can really reflect in a much more outward kind of way. So I think that that's very, very important. And then having pastors and other kinds of spiritual leaders really model what it means to think in a systems way, talking about different kinds of occupations from the pulpit and what it might mean to serve God in those different kinds of occupations. If it's appropriate, maybe even having your pastor. I mean, I love it. My pastor has come to my workplace several times. He's seen me
That's great.
teach, and I really love that I have a kind of pastor who's able to really share in my work with me. And I hope, he's learning some things too about this particular kind of space called an academic workspace. And maybe he'll learn something, about another type of workspace from someone else.
Totally. I mean, I think that's a great thing to do. Actually, it's making me think. I wonder who, if I could go visit some people in their workplace, if they'd be cool with that. I was thinking. Um, You were mentioning the idea of a pluralism within the workplace and almost like being not only like accepting of it, but almost like learning how to flourish within it. That was kind of part of one of the tensions, if I remember,
Hmm.
that you're saying. I would love for you to go into more depth on that. You seemed excited about that. That was something that was particularly on your heart. So what's going on with that tension and what did you discover about it?
It's been, I hope I'm going to be as transparent as I can be here. It's been kind of a journey for me leading this Institute on Religious Tolerance. I don't think of tolerance as like a go to. Like, no one just wants to be tolerated, right? They
I'll
want to be
tolerate you.
want to be accepted, and we want a healthy, robust
Yes.
religious pluralism and things like that. So I got kind of thinking about this, about 3 years ago when I first took on the directorship of this institute I lead at my university. And I had to really think about what it meant to lead such an institute as a Christian, and what was within my own faith tradition that would help me really love and respect others. I kind of was on a real journey because that's not the way I was raised. I was raised as a very conservative Baptist
Yes.
and almost a separatist. And so I didn't come to the game with those theological tools necessarily.
Yes.
But as I've read and thought, and really, quite frankly, prayed about it, I have so loved this work. And I have loved, trying to think about how I, as a Christian, can really help others and how we can really even be leading the way in a deep kind of acceptance and love of the other while retaining a distinctiveness. And I think a lot of the models of pluralism that we've gotten out there are either this kind of is separatist, like I'm better than you, or they are like, let's dumb everything down to the lowest common denominator and not have a sense of distinctiveness. So we talk in the book about how we can move from just talking about our faith, which is very much a traditional evangelical standpoint, right? It's almost like you're going to go home and you're going to check off a box if you shared your faith, which
Right.
means talking about it with someone. And certainly
Right.
there's room for that in some kinds of environments. But we want to really open up that box in a pluralistic environment and say, like, under what conditions is it best to talk about your faith? Under what conditions is it best to really listen to the others and try to really understand where another is coming from and respect them and approach them with a sense of humility, where remember that God image idea. If everyone is made in the image of God, then I as a Christian can really learn something, from my Hindu, my secular, my atheist, my Muslim coworker that actually might enhance my faith. Now, that's kind of controversial in some Christian circles. Like, we've started presenting
Right.
this material, and I would say we've gotten a little bit of pushback from some. But I found, even we could tell, even in the interview space, when we're interviewing people for our research, where it's not really our job to like tell people what to think, but just to listen to how they're thinking about things, that they kind of came to that themselves, that sort of feels freeing, that if I can listen to another and their faith story, then there's a space also for me to share my faith story.
Yeah. It's like, the stories that I would hear about faith in the workplace are like, hey, bring my Bible in. I
Mhm.
leave it on my desk. Someone would talk to me about it or ask a question or whatever. Like, just, hey, it's almost like, hey, here's the Christian flag. I'm throwing it out there. I'm a Christian. And so people can see that,
Mhm.
or again, like, how do we kind of share our faith, like you said? How do we tell our story? How do we give someone a clear gospel message, an evangelistic message, like at work, or like not at work, but like on the lunch break, or maybe, and it's like this encouragement. Again, nothing wrong with either of those things in my thinking, and yet there's something to it, like, hey, like, instead of really embracing this other person and trying to understand who they are, where they're coming from, what their beliefs are, why they believe it, why it would make sense to them, any of these things, it's almost like, basically the a priori assumption is that they're lost, they don't know, there's some like deep issue with them, and we're going to come in and we're going to save them.
Mhm.
Right. And it's, I guess when I'm thinking about that, I guess a part of me is like, well, what's wrong with that model, that thinking of just like, hey, we're just going to tell everyone the story. That's how I integrate my faith in my workplace, is I talk about Jesus or talk about the gospel
Mhm.
in the
Mhm.
workplace. And yet there seems to be, right, like this learning and humility posture that you guys are advocating for. And that can be a real paradigm shift for people, and almost like the feeling like, am I doing enough? Am I really being faithful
Hmm.
if all I'm doing, if I'm trying to learn, if I'm trying to understand, if I'm just trying to kind of like work with and embrace the pluralism, like, is that the tension that people
Yeah, and
feel?
people feel like they're kind of selling out. Like they're not
Yeah.
really being authentic enough. And I I will argue that it's the embracing a thoughtful pluralism is both the right thing to do and the effective thing to do if one of our aims is to make workplaces places where everyone can feel as religiously free as is appropriate given the type of work, and where there is a kind of space potentially for Christians to make relationships that lead to talking more about the Christian faith specifically. I think if you have both of those goals, that embracing a kind of authentic religious pluralism is the way to go. So, because at the end of the day, we don't want to just come home and check off a box that we put a Bible on the desk or we had one conversation about our Christian faith. That's not our goal. Our goal is to expose people to authentic Christianity, is that's one of our goals. And so if that's the case, I think making a space, a plural space where everyone can feel religiously free and where we as Christians even fight potentially for the rights of the other, that will meet that kind of larger goal.
This is super interesting to me because, through this podcast and through my work here as a church planner, really in many ways a missionary, working with friends, having friends that are in a lot of different camps. They aren't like Christian necessarily, or maybe they grew up and they have done nothing to do with it now, or many of them are Hindu or Muslim. And, thinking about how do I authentically represent Jesus, this sense of like, I want people to know who I am. I want my friends to know Jesus. I mean, that's like a huge driver in my life. And yet I have pushed it before and really pushed people away
Hmm.
because of that. And I'm not intentionally doing that. I don't think, like, I didn't want to push them away, I guess is what I mean. So it's like, how do you radically embrace others without compromise? I
Hmm.
guess. I guess that would then require like a definition of what compromise actually is. But what have you found? Like, how is it that we can radically embrace without compromise? Because that, when people hear radical embrace of others, many people I know think compromise. That's what that means. That just means we're not going to say the truth. We're not going to say what we really like, the things people need to hear. We're not going to put out what's real and what's true, what's godly out into the world. We're just going to be kind of passive
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
just allow people to, have not call a spade kind of thing.
Yeah,
What's
yeah.
your response to that?
It's gonna look really different depending on the kind of work environment. So I'm such an academic, but I still want people to understand these ideas
I
and
get
make
it. I
them
get it.
totally translatable too. So a kind of authentic religious pluralism is going to look different, I think, if you're in the tech industry in the Bay Area than if you're in the, just to make two aligned but different industry, if you're in the oil industry in Texas. And so in the tech industry in the Bay Area, you can expect that there are not a lot of Christians. And so I think that in some ways, there's a kind of room there to make sure that just like religion gets to the table at all, and there's a kind of like that's more of like a first step, tilling the ground kind of environment. And whereas I think if you are in a southern kind of environment, I think there's probably more room. There's the need to make sure that religion gets to the table and that you're really thinking about the rights of people of other religious traditions outside of your own. But then, because there are so many people who are religious and they tend to be religiously Christian and specifically evangelical Christians, to have a kind of slowness and calmness. There are a lot of stereotypes of evangelical Christians in the southern United States because there are so many of them. And so I think that's important to have a kind of calmness and slowness in that environment. And in both of these environments, you can still be distinctive. If we hold space for others to share authentically who they are, then I think they're more likely to hold space for us to share authentically who we are. And so if you're a person who, draws others into that type of space, I think we can expect a kind of more authentic learning and a more authentic teaching.
I really like that. I was thinking as you were talking, like, if you could take a wand and just like, wave it over a corporation and get the right plural, what would that look like? What, like, would it be, hey, we're going to have a lunch,
Mhm.
every month that talks about faith in the workplace, all kinds of faith, even including secular? What would that look like for policy if you were to waive that? Obviously, I
Mhm.
know it depends on the company, but let's say you waived it and here it is. Maybe a company like Amazon. Let me throw that one out there. What would you do?
Yeah, no, I don't know a whole lot about Amazon in particular, but I know what the spirit of what you're saying, that's sort of the big corporation. Firstly, I would want to make sure corporate leaders understand what the law is related to religious discrimination and don't break it. So we found often that people just didn't even know like what the law is related to religious discrimination. They didn't even know that it's possible to religiously discriminate. They didn't think that religion was included in non-discrimination policy. So I think it's important to, if you're a leader, to be trained yourself and to make sure that your company is aware of the kind of policies. Beyond that, the second piece of advice I have is to know your particular workforce and your particular region of the country. Leaders often ask me, like, oh my gosh, if I have like prayer rooms for this group, how is it going to stop? Are the Zoroastrians going to come next? Or this, I mean, there's so many different kinds of religious
Right.
groups. We just don't, I hear this a lot. We just don't have the money to even start. I'm like, oh, come on. Like, what are the groups that are likely to be present in your organization, given the type of industry you're in? And someone like me or just you looking up online can figure out what religions are present in your region of the country and in your industry. And then how might you start to create an accommodation space for those? And then if you really want to go further, I think encouraging employees to bring their whole selves to work, including their religious selves, and then asking them what they need. Do they need employee resource groups? There are employee resource groups often for all kinds of things and hobbies, and some corporations have done a great job, having them also for religious groups. There's a Muslim employee resource group, there's a Christian employee resource group, and those kind of situations. And maybe your employees actually want a workplace chaplain. We can talk with you as a pastor about whether you think that's a good idea or not to have chaplains actually in workplaces, but some organizations are even going that far. So what does it mean for employees to bring their whole selves to work, even their religious selves?
Yeah, I mean, I really like that, and I really feel like that is the way forward because, or at least part of the way forward for our current situation in this country, meaning the deep division, the deep distrust. Like, the only way we can learn to trust people is by knowing them
Mhm.
and knowing what they actually care about, not like what they're skilled at. That's one thing. And workplace focuses on skill. But of course, someone isn't just bringing their skills. They're bringing their values, like you said, their religion, their relationships, like all this stuff they are bringing to the workplace. And so why not just acknowledge that from the beginning? And why not create a set of ground rules for people, like, rules of engagement kind of thing, that where, like, something that would be obvious to me is like no coercion, right? In the sense that if someone is feeling coerced or someone is feeling like I don't want to be a part of this, they can say no, and then it's done, right? At that point, right? They're not forced to be a part of this. But I know that, you have issues like people in leadership talking to people that they're employees, and what are those, those things create power dynamics that make people uncomfortable. And it's like, it feels like there's such a complicated mix of values, and then like this workforce, like, sensitivity training and everything that's like, I don't know, it feels very, very complicated.
It does, it does. And I always want to share with my leader friends, let's do the low-hanging fruit first, right? Like let's just make sure we don't break the law.
Yes.
And then, let's understand your context and let's do what's practical for your particular context, right? And then if you want to go further, then maybe coaching and mentoring of you as the leader is warranted. And so and that's kind of like people who are getting really into this kind of thing. But let's start with a low hanging fruit. And let's remember that employees in general want to bring their whole selves to work, and they tend to be more loyal to their work when they're allowed to do so. And so there is a way in which this conversation, I hate to frame it this way, but there's a way in which this conversation does affect the bottom line, which I know leaders feel
Sure.
so pressed. They're like, how can you, I have all this stuff that you were mentioning that sentiment. And I completely agree, Josh. I have all this stuff that I'm about. How can I, like, now I have to care about people's religions too. Oh my gosh. And so, just like, let's calm a little bit and do what's easy first, right? And then understand people want to bring their whole selves to work, and then do what makes sense, for your organization and your context.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What would you say is, if you were to hear stories about, I've read the book and I did X, Y, and Z. What kind of stories have you heard, or would you want to hear? Like, have you heard from? Because it's not released yet, correct? I didn't look at that.
Yeah,
Or
it's
is it?
towards. I just got my advanced copies yesterday,
Yes. So
so it's
you're
coming out really soon, just in a couple of weeks. So in the mid of August. Yeah.
right. So the people that have pre-read it and all of that, and when it comes out, what kind of stories do you want to hear that would show you, hey, this book has done what I wanted it to do. It's fulfilled its purpose.
I think Denise and I want it to be a big conversation starter. And that's why we kind of go right to the center of the topics we think are most important. And we put discussion questions at the end of each chapter to make it really easy. We also have an audiobook from it, so you can listen to it. You don't even have to read. I know people are sometimes more into listening to books now. And to get together a group of people from your church, or get together a group of people from your industry and talk about these questions. Like, just pick 2 or 3 questions that make sense to you and spend 5 or 6 weeks and just kind of talk about these things. I think that some of the ideas that we and others bring up could potentially be life-changing and just make people feel more whole, that they're not needing to contain their faith just on Sunday, that they can live more authentically and in a more whole way. So that's kind of my goal, is that people would use these ideas to live more wholly, and in both senses, right? In most senses of that word, and in a way that really recognizes the other as made in the image of God. You were right in your first assessment that that's what we really want for people. And we want that kind of sensibility to decrease inequality in workplaces and really just help people live more authentically in their work.
I love that. So the book comes out soon. By the time this podcast comes out, it'll probably be right around there. And so where is there a preferred vendor for the book? And then how can people get involved with what you're doing and follow your work?
Thank
And
you
what you
for
have
that
coming up?
opportunity. The book is with InterVarsity Press, so you can order it on the InterVarsity Press website. It's called Working for Better, A New Approach to Faith at Work, and my co-author is Denise Daniels, or you can order it from another book vendor, from Amazon or other places. There's also an audiobook. We just got an audiobook contract, which is really fun. We were really hoping for
That's
that.
cool.
And so you can order that or download that as well. And for me, just go to my website, which is ElaineHowardEcklund.com. And you can find, lots of stuff about my work. If you want to invite me to speak or do some consulting with your organization, that's something I do on the side as well. And oh my gosh, Josh, thank you. This has been awesome.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I mean it. Like, we would love to have that conversation. We're always looking for great sociologists who can help us understand what the heck is happening right now in this country and in our culture and society. So I'm sure my co-host would love to talk with you, and I know I'd love to do it again. And this was a great conversation. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today.
Thank you. Thank you. What you're doing is really important.
Thank you so much. And to our friends and our viewers, guys, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Faith Roundtable. Make sure you go pick up Elaine's book. We'll put all sorts of Links there in the description. I don't know why I always forget the word links, but we're going to put links in the description so you can get the book, go to the website, all that stuff. And until next time, guys, take care and God bless.